Today, we're going to be speaking with Nicole Perlroth, who's an award-winning cybersecurity journalist for the New York Times and also author of This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyber Weapons Arms Race. It's so great to have you on. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
So let's just start kind of at the top level. I think a lot of people who are aware of a cyber threat and about the priority that this has become for so many governments may not really understand what a cyber attack might actually mean sort of for the average person. You might have a vague idea about could you shut down a water system, for example, or paralyze an electricity grid or something like that. What do we mean by cyber attack? What are the types of things that could be done?
So, for a long time, people's real experience with cyber attacks was really just the theft of their personal data or maybe their credit card information, and there was no real repercussions there. You might have to deal with identity theft if it got really gnarly, but for the most part, your bank would probably pay you back if any money was stolen from your account or credit card information, that kind of thing. The problem is that these days we have rolled so much software into our critical infrastructure, like the power grid, like our nuclear plants, like our water treatment facilities and wastewater treatment plants, that all of those access points can be the target for a cyber attack. And in fact, we are seeing every year more nation state hackers, but also low level cyber criminals target these systems. And so the attack that we really fear would be an attack that took out power and potentially contaminated the water. And actually, it would look a lot like what we just witnessed in Texas a few weeks ago when the power went out. The water supply was contaminated. And in the event of a cyber attack, which you could use cyber means to take out the power and contaminate the water, and we've seen Russia do that in Ukraine, and we just saw an attempt to contaminate the water supply in a small town in Florida the other week. Fortunately, it was caught. But the problem is with the cyber attack, there's also the possibility that hackers could keep those systems down. And when we've run studies here in the United States to see how resilient our critical infrastructure is to a cyber attack, some of those simulations have showed that it could be years before people were able to bring those systems back online. So I think we're a little bit better than we were when those simulations were done, but there's a real threat of a cyber attack on the grid.
So when it comes to the kind of identity theft, credit card theft stuff that many of us have dealt with, all of a sudden I had a period where like Uber and DoorDash charges were showing up on my credit card and the annoyance type stuff. It seems the motivation of the individual is basically to get free stuff, to get a free takeout or a free Uber ride or whatever the case may be. When we start talking about things like shutting down a power grid, contaminating water, etc., correct me if I'm wrong. It seems we're talking about a fork that is more malicious for the sake of being malicious, of making a political point, of making an attack that may be more against an institution or a country or an organization. Are these two forks in terms of motivations, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of the attacks we have seen on critical infrastructure has been messaging. When Russia shut off the power in Ukraine, first in 2015 and then in 2016, they only did it for a few hours. And I really believe that that was to send a message
Mm.
to sort of seed doubt in Ukrainians' mind that their new government had things under control. It was really political messaging and sort of hanging this threat over the population that Russia could turn off the power at the flip of a switch. Other attacks have had different motivations. We caught Iran rifling around the controls at a dam in the United States. Fortunately, it was the wrong dam. We have two Bowman dams. One of them holds back a tsunami's worth of water in Oregon, and the other holds back a babbling brook in New York. And they got into the one that holds back a babbling brook, and it was under repair. So it wasn't an actual threat, but who knows what the message was there. I think it was probably just some sort of experimentation to see if they could get into these systems in case they needed to one day, unleash the locks at that dam. And that's more of what we're starting to see. We're starting to see nation state hackers get into these critical infrastructure systems, not necessarily because they want to do something immediately, but because we're all planning for some kind of geopolitical trigger where we might need to be in a position to turn off the lights or unleash the locks at a dam or contaminate the water supply. But each of these attacks essentially enshrines critical infrastructure as a legitimate target for a cyber attack. And at the end of the day, it's civilian populations who would suffer the results of those attacks. So it's getting
Yeah.
more dangerous.
So this is one of my questions about how this fits into warfare more broadly, because, one of the things that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is we've heard more about, and it actually has moved in the direction of the idea of a war that's like a boots on the ground war, the likes of which, certainly the first Gulf War, to a degree, the 2003 Iraq War. Things are moving away from that. Drone warfare is certainly part of it, but also so is cyber warfare. But a foreign power, for example, shutting off electricity in a large part of the United States, we understand the chaos that it will create. We understand the damage it can do. But how would it fit into a broader war in the sense of what would it be part of trying to accomplish for the foreign power that does it? I'm guessing it's not shut the power off so they can steal Florida from us and make it part of some other country. There must be, what would be the goal, or how would it fit in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's an important question because you don't want to overhype the threat.
Right.
But it is the reality that Russia has been targeting our grid for several years now. A few years ago, the Department of Homeland Security published a screenshot that literally showed Russian hackers inside our power plants with their fingers on the switches that could turn off the lights. So we know that they have gotten into these systems, which begs the question, what are they doing there? At what point will they see some kind of incentive or motivation to turn off the lights?
Right.
I do think that this is all battlefield preparation for some future event, whether it's, a declaration of war. And this would be one element of that warfare, turning off the lights or shutting off the communication systems in the event that geopolitical tensions got so heated that one of these countries felt the need to do so. We have been hacking into Russia's grid. I broke that story with my colleague David Sanger a couple of years ago, partly as retaliation, somewhat for the election, but also for Russia's hacks and incursions of our own grid. But we've been doing it more as mutually assured destruction to say,
I was
hey,
going to say, it reminds me of like during nuclear weapon development, a lot of people say, what is the circumstance where we would ever use even 10 of these nukes? Like, what is that situation? Right. And it becomes this conversation of, well, if they did it, we would need to be in a position to do it. And being in a position to do it would disincentivize them from doing it. It has a sort of similar feel, as you mentioned that.
Yes, it is our attempt at mutually assured destruction in the digital age. The problem is that nuclear analogies really don't fit so neatly in cyber. For one, this is all code, right? We're attacking these systems with code. There's a low barrier to entry. If we hack a system, it is entirely possible for that attack to be discovered, for those methods to be discovered, for that code to be picked up and reverse engineered and retrofitted and used back on us. And in cyber, what we've noticed over the last 10 years is that people learn a lot from their adversary. We pulled off an attack with Israel on Iran's nuclear plant, where we broke into their nuclear facility, Natanz nuclear facility. We dispatched code that jumped from their Microsoft Windows systems into their industrial controllers. And we eventually used that code to spin their uranium centrifuges out of control or slowed them down. And we ultimately destroyed 1,000 of their centrifuges. No one has pulled off a cyber attack of that level of sophistication since. But what our adversaries have learned is they don't need to have the sophistication of that attack to do damage. A couple years after that attack, we saw Iran hit Saudi Aramco, world's largest oil company, Saudi Arabia, with an attack that just use rudimentary code to wipe out the data on their systems and replace it with an image of a burning American flag. And so we're all sort of learning after each other, and each attack has sort of built off the capabilities of the last. And unlike nuclear, where you need fissile material to drop a bomb,
Right.
in cyber, you just need a laptop and someone with the skills. And increasingly, you can purchase those skills and code and capabilities off a gray market. So it's a really unregulated space. Um, it is getting more and more dangerous, particularly as we digitize more of our infrastructure. And the thing I think people don't realize is that, America might still be the greatest offensive player in this realm. Like I said, no one has pulled off anything close to the attack we pulled off on Iran more than 10 years ago. But we are also the most targeted. We have more nation states and cyber criminals lined up at our borders, at our systems, knocking on the door, getting in a lot of cases, and planting backdoors. And we're the most vulnerable in a lot of cases because we are so wired, much more so than adversaries like North Korea and Iran, et cetera.
So on that note, I mean, in the limited time we have left, the reaction of some might be, well, we've got to pull all of we have to go backwards technologically. We have to get a lot of stuff that's currently networked off of networks, silo things, et cetera. In most instances, that's not really a solution to problems. Would it be
Right.
the wrong reaction to this?
No, I mean, I think we do need to step back and think harder about the defense of these systems.
Hmm.
80% of America's critical infrastructure is owned and maintained by private companies. And any attempt to sort of legislate that they have better security has always failed. Lobbyists have always watered it down. So any attempt to secure our critical infrastructure has come in the form of an executive order, first under Obama, and then there was one under Trump. But really, these are all just setting voluntary standards for these critical infrastructure owners to up their security. And unfortunately, a lot of these systems are owned by small, medium-sized businesses, local municipal systems that simply don't have the security budgets or resources of a PG&E, say, here in California. So they have to rely on this outside network of contractors and supervisors. And the fact that they have to let those people in remotely creates an opportunity for hackers. So, what do we do? If we're not going to legislate that these companies have to up their security, what do you do? And I think one of the things that we need to start talking about is creating better market incentives for these companies to up their security, giving tax credits maybe to companies who use two-factor authentication and have all of their software up to date and pass with flying colors on a penetration testing exam. Or perhaps it's time to exact penalties on companies who are not updating and patching their systems and allowing anyone to remote in. So I do actually think it's a really important question to ask ourselves, okay, if we're not going to let the government into these private systems, if we're going to rely on the market, well, the market has always led us down a path of further vulnerability because security has no return on investment.
Yeah, it's the Deepwater Horizon, the $500,000 valve that
Yes,
if you install it everywhere, you protect, but it's unlikely you'll need it everywhere, and then they install it nowhere at all.
that's such a great analogy. I hadn't thought of that, but that is the perfect analogy. And so we really need to have these conversations around how to lock up these systems. And there's been some conversations about should we have a digital Geneva Convention?
Mm.
Should we set some kind of international norms of behavior where we would agree not to hack Russia's power grid and they would agree not to hack ours or hospitals or elections? The problem is we, the United States, will never agree to those norms because one, we still have a huge offensive advantage, but also two, we don't trust that our adversaries would hold to those agreements because they outsource many of their attacks to cyber criminals, to contractors and front companies. The attacks that we conduct out of the United States come out of the Pentagon Cyber Command or maybe the NSA if it's espionage or the other intelligence agencies. We don't rely on some security engineer at Google and tap them on the shoulder at night and say, tonight you're working with us we just don't have that ability or plausible deniability. So we worry that if we ever agree to these norms, that these other countries would just sort of say, well, we won't do it, but they would outsource those attacks to these
Right.
other
We
groups.
don't really want to commit not to doing it, and we wouldn't believe that their commitment would be trustworthy. They may believe the exact same about us
Right,
as well, and it makes it a
right.
very complicated situation. We've been speaking with Nicole Perlroth, who is a cybersecurity journalist for the New York Times. The book is "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends: The Cyber Weapons Arms Race." Nicole, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.